Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Amber.
I'm so excited. Thanks for having me.
Amber, it's awesome to have a media celebrity like you in the tank. You started your career as an intern at BNN and you worked your way up. I have to ask you just to kick things off, what were some of the things you learned during those early years working in media and at BNN that helped you start your journey and the lessons you learned during those early days?
I mean, I was pretty terrified most of the time because I didn't know anything about TV and I definitely didn't know anything about finance. And I think fear is a big motivator for me. It sort of makes sure that I show up to work every day, like trying to absorb absolutely everything. So I walked into that newsroom. I was so young. I was fresh out of school, not knowing much about either world. And what ensued over what became a 15-year career is really just studying at the feet of absolute professionals on air. But also, like, I basically got an MBA, not an actual one, because don't ask me to model anything. But I basically got an MBA just listening to the channel, interviewing the guests, back when I was a producer, just to figure out how do all these pieces fit together. And then ultimately, what my foundational question right now, like when I'm interviewing or doing my work, is like, how can I make this the most useful for viewers?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started my career fresh out of school working on the trading desk at RBC, and I was just an intern too, running around grabbing coffees. But at any time I handed someone a coffee, I would ask them a question. I would say, what are you working on? What's going on in the markets today? What's the most interesting story? I feel like you had a bit of a similar experience just trying to absorb everything around you because everything was moving so fast, especially the job you had, right?
So I didn't know how to make coffee. And that was one of my key initial functions. And this is something I tell kids now is like, I actually when I came to BNN, I had a degree. I'd finished a master's in journalism. My very first article that I'd ever written ended up being like an expose that broke a national scandal. It was on the front page of the Globe and Mail, and we can get into what that was. But like I came in pretty hot or feeling pretty hot about myself. And then I was given like mugs to deal with, to fill up coffee cups, bring them to the guests and mic up the guests. And I think there could have been a part of me that said, what? Like, are you kidding me? I did a master's to do this. But I'm so glad that I started that way because then every year I was just building the foundation. I knew everything about that business because I had started from the bottom. So if something went wrong in a part of my work as a producer, for example, like I didn't need to resort to anybody else, or I could understand the entire process on like how to get to a solution.
That's interesting. School does something I find interesting where it builds you up to think you are at the top of something or at the forefront of building something. But then the workforce kind of breaks you back down to the bare bones and then builds you up slower over time. And I was fortunate to do co-op. So during school, I also got to see what it was like being a coffee runner. You obviously came out of school with a huge piece that allowed you to get to where you started off working at BNN. What was that piece that you wrote about?
Part of the journalism program at what was then called Ryerson, when you do the master's, is you have to do like a major piece of journalistic work. And for no reason in particular, I chose the fertility industry. And so, I had a year to work on it. And I remember not really getting anywhere. This was back before like IVF was covered and they were just thinking about, are we going to cover IVF? So I posted in a couple of Facebook groups. I said, hey, I'm like a student at Ryerson. And I ended up getting a phone call from a woman who told me, as a result of her fertility challenges, she decided to have her sister be her surrogate. And I remember thinking, okay, well, maybe that can be the story, the lengths that people go to. And we're on the line for like half an hour while she tells me this story. And I'm, in the back of my mind, I'm like, where's the story? How do I build a project out of this? And then towards the end of the call, she says, this is going to have to be on background. But what I have to tell you is that the father was meant to be the woman's husband, the woman who was trying to have a child.
Right.
Except when the baby was born, they found out that he was not the father. And her sister was married and who she was married to was not the father either. And this wasn't a case of extramarital affairs. And then when she confronted the doctor said he accidentally must have mixed up the sperm. And so the child was born to an unknown father. And she kind of tells me this at the end of, I'm like, well, but says, don't tell anyone. I was like,
Right.
well, like the story. And because I had a year to work on it, I had a year to develop my relationship with her. Obviously, we had to tell the story, right? That's the only way to affect change. But I had to get her to, be comfortable with me, to trust me. And this doctor wasn't just any doctor. He was a recipient of the Order of Canada. He wasn't like a backwoods doctor. He was somebody who had quite a bit of notoriety. Through our investigative work, I found another couple that this happened to. Then I found a single mom that this happened to. And then it was like, she was a single mom. She wanted sperm donor Y. She got sperm donor X. Well, like at least you have a baby, just like go along your merry way. So this doctor ended up having a pattern of doing this to, maybe lesbian couples, maybe single mothers, where perhaps it wasn't as mission critical who the father was. But in this instance, she wanted her husband to be the father.
Right.
So I worked on this for a year. I learned so much, right? I was filing freedom of information requests. I ended up interviewing that doctor. He didn't know that that's what I was coming to interview him about. He just thought it was another person going to fan out on his work because, again, as I said, he had such notoriety. And so that was all like in my, so that's like big journalism stuff.
Wow.
And as I said, when it came out, it was on the front page of the Globe and Mail. Subsequently, Dr. Barwin, that's who the doctor was, he lost his Order of Canada. And what was interesting, when I was doing the research, the children were not related to each other. But as more and more people came forward, they were related to each other. And unfortunately, it looks like Dr. Barwin was the source material for some of them.
Right.
So
I've heard that story. That is crazy. That is unbelievable. As a student, to be exposed to that is unbelievable. It reminds me of a documentary I saw about how like there was this twins that were separated at birth, or triplets. And there was this whole thing about how this organization, this orphanage, was basically making money off of dividing up families and stuff like that. It was a huge documentary at TIFF. But I don't want to digress into that too much. But I do think that it's an important lesson that you're sharing, where you were really built up because of this story and the notoriety of it on the front page, to then go into an intern role at BNN and have to be broken back down and basically get an MBA in finance. Completely different, I'm sure, than what you were learning in school. But what was the turning point for you to get confidence to go from behind the camera to in front of the camera?
I think I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I think, my parents would say at a young age, I've always said, I want to be famous. I just have no talent. I can't act, I can't sing, and I can't dance. But there's a part of me that seeks out the limelight. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll be like an entertainment reporter. Part of why I wanted to do journalism in the first place was, I was kind of a social justice warrior. And I thought, well, I don't want to do business. My undergrad was in business. I'm like, I don't want to do any of that. I want to tell important stories like the fertility story that I broke. And I was like, that's going to be my career. Unfortunately, I sort of hit the reality of the job world. And everybody wants to be an entertainment reporter. Everybody wants to do documentary work. But there's very few young people who step into the world of financial journalism, and even fewer that look like me. There's and I'm just being honest about that. So I was able to stand out, use my differences as an advantage. And I'll say that in the beginning, it was an advantage. And then it's just, there's no secret. It's just hard work. It's like being fearful and using that fear to drive you and just be hard work. Like your 20s are so difficult because you feel insecure. You're trying to find your place in the world. You're starting at the bottom. And there's a lot of insecurity that comes with that. I used it to motivate me. I joke, if something wasn't going well, I would cry. I would cry in the bathroom because I misspelled something. That's how badly I cared, and that's how much I wanted it. And now that I'm older, and I'm not that old, but I used to say, in the last couple of years, I'm like, I don't think enough people are crying in the bathroom. And like, that's not because I'm a tyrant, I hope. But it's like, I don't know. Do you care? Does the younger generation care? Like, I really cared. It mattered to me so much. And I remember those milestones. Like when I moved from being an intern to a producer, like I called my mom. I was so excited. I'm like, look at this. Look at what I've accomplished. So I kind of knew that was the goal. So that's what I was able to do. But I also was really fortunate to work at an organization where, Matt, I was 25 when I was on air. That's super young, especially
Very
with the
young.
subject matter that we were dealing with. And I didn't know anything. I knew how to read and put it together. But who I am now, I'm only that good because I started so young and I was with an organization that took a big risk, took a chance on me, saw something in me, but knew I wasn't quite there yet and just took a risk. And then I had mentors like other on-air people. They were not hostile. They did not try to undercut me. They really lifted me up, like Francis Hordelski, Marty Say, Howard Green, all these like legends of BNN. Kim Parley, I just wouldn't be here if they didn't look at me and say, like give a hand to lift me up.
That's incredible. And it's also great advice, especially for people in their 20s as well, who may think that crying is a bad thing, but crying means caring or, showing commitment to something, even though it's going to basically make you run through walls to get to the other side is what people like to see. And people obviously saw that in you. Who did you look up to though, on like the finance side to understand, more about the markets or investing or how things work behind the curtain? Because you've done, I don't know how many interviews over your career. They obviously got better and better over time, but what was it you think that really was the unlock for you to become better at your interview style?
So again, I'll go back to maybe three seminal people at BNN. Like obviously I learned from the guests. Sitting as a producer, your main job is to just, they call it pre-interviews, right? So you're just like having a conversation before the anchor has a conversation. And that is not limited by time. You can ask any question you want and you can just learn, about Google, about this. Why are they, finding this as an investment opportunity and just kind of file it away. You don't realize it in the moment, but like it's layers, right? You're learning layer by layer. So all of those guest interviews, like doing the background pre-interviews, that was a privileged position to be in. People don't get access to billion-dollar fund managers to talk to them, for 30 minutes about, what they're doing in their portfolio. So that was really valuable. I knew that was unique access. So I just would like file that away and try and make sense of that. I did the securities course, like not my CFA, but that also, I was like, to be honest, I'd been producing segments on bonds without really knowing what a bond was. And then doing the security course, I was like, oh, like, well, this makes so much sense. So I always said, I'm like, this should be just a required course for anybody who wants to do this because it's basic level enough, but it just levels you up kind of right away. And then most of the education, though, Matt, was those icons at BNN. Francis Hordelski taught me how to research about the market. I don't know a lot, but I know how to find the information. And a lot of that is thanks to her. I am addicted to my Bloomberg terminal. I'm out on my own. I'm a startup founder now with my own podcast. And like that Bloomberg terminal is very expensive. And that's just, I'm
Yes,
paying
it
for
is.
it because
I
I just need it. I cannot be away from my Bloomberg. I love charting and going deep into things. But Francis is the one who taught me how to use that, how to, turn all those numbers into a story. I had another anchor, Marty, who was her co-host at the time, and he was a student of something called the Bloomberg Way, which is a book that somebody high up at Bloomberg basically wrote. And Bloomberg's philosophy is about telling the story and telling it in a clear way. So, here's an example. Earnings missed expectations. The company's guidance was lower than expected. What is that? Does that really tell you anything? How about profit at Coca-Cola came in worse than feared. And the company is warning that this year is going to be disappointing, right? One are facts and the other is a story, but it's the same thing. And so that was another unlock moment. And I think that's applicable not just to journalists, but to everybody who's trying to communicate. The data is one thing. You need to take a step back and think, how would I tell this to my grandmother? How would I
Right.
communicate this using words, simple language? Part of why I thought I existed in finance was just to unpack jargon. Like they use such unnecessary jargon, GFC, Great Financial Crisis, LSD, low single digits. So much of my job is just like turning jargon into sentences. And that's really valuable to people. But clear communication is something anybody can use.
That's a great point because, finance is a pretty dry subject and hedge fund managers are pretty dry people. And so turning what they say into more digestible and sort of lifelike conversations is, I think, what the skill set that you really are exemplifying when you were there for
Well,
15 years.
and like it's actually creative work, right? As you said, it
Right.
can be dry. It's dry if you see it, but I look at numbers now and I'm like, what's the story? How do I turn annual revenue into a story? What is the story that I can tell? And also how it's different from regular news is, the worst thing that is happening to people is they're losing money. And I know I don't want to mitigate that because that can be very devastating. But we used to work right next to CP24 and it was like fires, murders,
Right.
children being kidnapped. Like ultimately, what we're trying to do in my neck of the woods is we're just trying to make money, right? We're just trying to make money. We're talking about positive things. We're talking about entrepreneurship. We're talking about people who risked everything to build the next Shopify, to build the next great thing. And I just love those stories. It's inherently optimistic. Yes, things go wrong, but we're all striving for greatness, right? Yes, there are frauds. There's all of that. But generally, we're all just trying to do well, to make money. And I fundamentally believe like investing changes people's lives. So if you can help people do that better, it's work that is well worth it.
Absolutely. I didn't even think about this until you mentioned it, but I used to write the morning reports when I was at RBC on the trading desk and send them out to all of our distribution lists. And I had to turn those headline Bloomberg articles into some part of a paragraph or a story. And not until this moment did I realize that when I write my quarterly reports for my LPs in my fund, am I using those same skills to kind of tell the stories of these startups and translate them into some story that our LPs can consume when they read these quarterly updates. So that was a really interesting flashback for me. But, the hardest part must have been for you to step away from BNN Bloomberg, such an iconic brand, such an iconic role you had. What was the turning point for you to realize that it was time to leave BNN after 15 years and go out on your own?
It's so tough now that I've done it. It's like, yeah, I did it. But the months leading up to the decision was filled with consternation because I loved the job so much. There might have been things that I didn't love, but the job was not it. I loved my high. If I get a high from this job, it's like finding information out and getting to be one of the first people to tell you, or doing an interview where I know the guest just told me something that you can't find anywhere else. But that is an actual high for me. That's sort of what kept me going. So every part of the job was very exciting. The team that I got to work with was amazing and so supportive. But, as I said, I've been doing it for 15 years. And this is true of all media organizations, especially legacy ones. The resources that are being allocated to do the job are much lower, but the demands in many cases are sort of increasing. And so I had to reconcile that against what was going on in my own life as well. I have 3 kids. I had them in the last 7 years, and basically every other year, I had a kid. And it was actually kind of easy to go back to work each time in the sense of, I got sort of flexible hours, but when your kids are young, you come home, they're 1 year old, like there's not much to do with them, right? You're just kind of hanging out at home. Now they're a bit older. my whole life is just like logistics and setting things up and afternoon activities and driving them here and there. And I didn't really want to miss out on that. But like from a logistics point, it was very difficult if I was all of a sudden out of the mix in the evenings because I was already out of the mix in the mornings. My husband had stepped in for that. He works too. So it was a bit of like that work-life balance. But one of the biggest fears was, am I really going to step away from BNN Bloomberg? Who am I if I'm not Amber from BNN Bloomberg? Or BBN, as my grandmother calls it. They could never get the acronym right. But like, who am I? And am I just going to do like a YouTube show? Isn't that kind of a step down? Like that, I would say that was the fear. I think I've always had an entrepreneurial streak in me. I just didn't have much confidence that I could stand alone and still deliver what I wanted to do. So, but at the same time, I knew a couple of things to be true. One, I knew I was hardworking. Two, I think I developed after 15 years a kind of intimate relationship with our viewers. I really cared about them and making sure that they were well served. You know, I always knew that my constituent was not the guest I was interviewing. It was the person who was receiving those insights. And so I think I developed a reputation for not being soft with my guests because I knew who I was truly serving. And I got the sense that they were kind of protective of me too. Like I started at 25, I required a lot of grace, not only from BNN, but from the viewers. Because if I was like, and I was atrocious, I was atrocious when I started, but our audience is so nice. Like they really, I got so much love from them. And yes, there are the trolls, but I actually think I get a lot of love from the viewers. And particularly, you know, when I would do interviews that were actionable, I got a lot of feedback, positive feedback. So I thought,
I watched your
after
interviews,
all this
Amber.
time,
You were not soft. You were definitely one that asked hard questions and also like very like personal questions, not ones that you would just see like on the teleprompter to be, you know, forced upon you.
and I would say like that's because of the high that I would get on getting something out of a guest that nobody else had gotten. So that's kind of what motivated me. But it was also just, I knew that after all this time, what do people love? They find macro is fine, but like, how do you really make money? It's just ideas. And I like that too. Like, I love stress testing ideas. Should I buy this here? And what could go wrong? And what if I just did a whole show just on that? And yes, I wouldn't be able to do the macro stuff. I mean, I can do everything. I can do macro, I can do commodities, but like, what if I just did a pure investable show? And, you know, the response initially has been really, really positive. I'm blown away. I thought, you know, in the first couple of episodes that maybe, I don't know, maybe like 20, 100 people would tune in. We've had thousands already and hopefully will grow. But it's been really positive. And I'm also catching like a structural tailwind. As you know, podcasting is growing, especially YouTube podcasting. So I think a couple of years ago it would have been like, ooh, she's leaving to do a YouTube show. But now like I'm not an early mover on this. Like YouTube is here. This is how people are consuming content. And so there I am as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously the traditional finance journalism world has changed since when you started in the industry, and you obviously chose a video podcast. I got to ask though, was there an option to join another platform, maybe even another legacy platform? Or were you so inspired to start your own program in the money versus doing something again on another platform?
I definitely entertained it. But let me give you some perspective. My last day was Friday, and I was in meetings about my podcast on Monday. So like I just am somebody, and this served me well in news. Like I just move very fast. Once I know I want something, like we just have to get on with it, right? I launched the podcast 2 months after leaving BNN. So could I have gotten another job? Maybe, like probably. It would have maybe taken a couple of weeks. It would have been a role that I already kind of had conviction about this idea. And I did speak with other organizations and I said, this is what viewers want. Podcasting is huge. And I was trying to force basically what In the Money is right now into another organization. And of course, they were hesitant because they've got their own thing going on. They've got their own like ideas. And after a while, I was like, why am I trying to jam this into another organization? Why don't I just do it? If it does well, maybe that organization will be interested and will license it. Like that's how I was thinking back then. But it just was like, it was moving too slow for me. And I thought, well, why not
like
just
those
get off the
platforms
ground? And I
used to
wanted
offer
to,
a lot of infrastructure, and now you don't need that infrastructure. It's so much cheaper and easier to just do it yourself. That's the whole thing.
yeah, and there were some costs. Like there's, I'm looking around my studio. There's some costs, but all the equipment was $10,000, and that's a big investment. But like I'd prepared for that financially. I have to learn how to podcast. I didn't know how to do that, but I also didn't let it get in the way of me starting a podcast. It was, I never let knowledge get in the way of anything. And then I was really fortunate. I work with a producer whom you know as well, Jillian Glickman, and we work together at BNN. She's ex-CNBC. And the day before I quit, she was working at a startup, and she texted me and said, the startup it's not working out. So I'm going to be looking for a new job. And I texted her, I said, my last day is tomorrow. And she didn't know that. And I just feel like the universe brought us together. And since then, we've just been like working on launching this together. So I haven't been doing it by myself. Like I have an amazing team, and I'm grateful to those people for taking that early risk on me. Like a lot of people did take an early risk on me, not just the team. I had advertisers before I launched a show, and guests who came on before I launched the show. I had the first month booked before the show had even launched. And so I'm grateful to that like early support. And I don't know, Matt, if I waited 6 months to see if like, oh, am I going to get a PR job? Am I going to go back into news, but not really be valued? I don't know if that would have all been around.
No, you 100% made the right decision. I can definitely say that. Even when we spoke, the first time about you getting started and some of the things I shared with you about my journey, you already had so much accomplished before even launching that other podcasters don't even have buttoned up. So you were well ahead of the game. And obviously having your partner in crime, Jillian Glickman, working with you, who went from newsroom colleague to business partner, gives you a huge leg up as well on going faster. But I got to ask, like when you and Jillian got together, what was your ideas of what an ideal episode would look like? How do you and Jillian even think about preparing for interviews differently than maybe when you were back at BNN?
So, well, and actually, Matt, I didn't really think what I was doing was all that trailblazing. And it was a conversation with you that kind of made me think like, oh, is this unique? Is this a risk? You said something like you're kind of the first legacy media to totally go out on your own. And so that was kind of an aha moment for me too.
In
and
Canada,
I don't think I thought of it that way. In Canada, of course, in Canada, yes. There's many prolific examples south of the border, but yes, in Canada. So I didn't really think of it that way. But now that we're doing it, I think the good news is, me and Jillian, because we had the same sort of work experience, and then she was at CNBC, we saw the same thing. We know what viewers want. So that was a check mark, right? They want actionable insights. They want it from a reputable person. That was a check mark. We have all those contacts. Now, in the short attention span world, they now have the patience to listen to more ideas for a longer period. They're liking all the follow-up questions. So where I was constrained by time on cable news, I'm not constrained by. So many times I'm doing a 7-minute interview. I have to make a choice. Am I going to follow up on that really interesting point and risk not getting to points, C, D, and E, and then make the whole interview about the first point? So those were my trade-offs. So am I going to make this whole interview about this one point, or do I have to move on? And I hated that because I felt like I was shortchanging the viewer either way, right? If I don't ask the follow-up, it's shortchange. But then if they're like, why was this interview on this one thing the whole time? That's all the time that I have. So it became a skill, like trying to get the insights out of in like 7 minutes. But now I have an hour, and it's amazing, right? Like
it's
the
luxurious.
guests that I've interviewed, I've been interviewing. Yeah. But also I'm learning more about them. Like I did an interview with Eric Nettle. I can't tell you how many times I've done an interview with him. And for the first time ever, I asked him about climate change because I didn't have, in a 7-minute interview about OPEC or whatever, it would have been like at a left field. Like, what are you, but now I had a chance to ask, like, how did you become Eric Nettle, the energy guy? Do you believe in climate change? And we can like get into, it's so rich. It's so interesting. In a 7-minute interview, it's not germane to anything, but now I can really get into it. So I'm really loving it. The good news is like, the product is not the problem. We have a lot of problems at AK Media. Internet is a big one. Just stability of connection. So there's like back end operational things, but the great news is like the actual product, the team, like everything is a check mark.
It definitely is everything. I mean, I want to talk about investing in the markets just because I have you. Before we get into some of the other things, I got to ask, what is your personal investing philosophy, and how has it evolved over time since you started learning from some of the best in the business?
So I will tell you a story of how it got cemented during the pandemic. Obviously, it was a pandemic. It was a crisis time for a lot of people. Everything was in flux. My personal story is that I was on maternity leave and kind of side note, like dying that I couldn't be on TV because there were all these breaking stories. And I'm like, I can't believe I'm missing this.
Serious
so that
FOMO,
aside,
for sure.
Serious. In fact, I emailed our managing editor. I'm like, can I just come back for like a week? Like just a week to do. Anyway, it would have been a whole admin thing. So I did not come back for a week. So I had a 2-year-old. I just had a baby. So she was 3 months old in March. And we went to my parents' house for March break. And then that's when the pandemic hit and we didn't leave for 6 months. So like very chaotic. Yeah. Well, think about that, right? Like every week was like, okay, I'd already kind of quarantined with them. And so all the playgrounds in Toronto were closed. I'm like, I'm not about to be in my tiny house, no outdoor capacity with a 2-year-old now who can't go to school and a newborn, like nobody's sleeping and no help, right? There was nobody who could like come to the house to help. So during the pandemic, we kind of like were already at my parents' house. And if we left, it would have meant not seeing them. So we kind of like early bubbled, I guess. But we came, for March break and we had a trip to Florida planned. We canceled it. And then it was like months and months of, remember this, Matt? Just 2 more weeks. We just have to quarantine for 2 more weeks.
All over again, every day.
Yeah. And then it will be over. And it just never was over. So a 2-week March break turned into 6 months living with my parents. So that was going on. And this, I promise this is related to my trading philosophy. Something had happened, I don't know, with my trading account. I guess my address wasn't up to date. And back then, like, it was like a paper needed to be filled out and just documents needed to be handled. It wasn't just a simple online system. And in conclusion, my trading account was frozen. I couldn't do anything in it. And so March 2020, the markets are plunging and I'm locked out of my trading account. It didn't matter because I had all these other things going on, like the baby, whatever. We're not living at home. So it was, I couldn't access it and I didn't fix the problem for months. And thank goodness I didn't, because what happened? One of the most stunning recoveries in stocks that we've ever seen. It all came roaring back and then some. And that moment taught me, they always say like, don't panic sell. It's one thing to say it, but then to not physically be able to panic sell was sort of a groundbreaking moment for me. I also understand that my time horizon is very, very long. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what stocks I'm going to add to the portfolio. And then I do my level best never to sell. And my biggest investing mistakes tend to be when I sell. And that's only because I sell too early or I take a loss and then things rip up. Everything has a cycle. When energy was washed out, it's easy to just cut your energy exposure. When gold was washed out, it's easy to just cut your gold exposure. And then everything has a cycle. Gold comes back. And, I did sell my gold stocks. So I'm not participating in this cycle because I locked in like a 30% gain. missing out on so much more. And I just know my core investing principle is I know what you own and be in it for the long term. And even if something is up like 75%, if you hold it with the fullness of time, like that could be a 10x. And I have that time horizon, right? I have 20 years, hopefully, or more to be invested. So that's sort of my philosophy. But I was taught that lesson during the pandemic.
You were forced on that lesson was forced upon you. And I actually have a similar philosophy, but I have to live in this world because I'm in privates, right? I invest in startups. So I can't sell anything. But when I was on the trading desk, it was volatility all the time. So I have a public portfolio that I don't really touch. But I do have some capital I use for trading vol because I just love like event driven is what I did. M&A is what I did, vol trading, option trading. I just have fun with that. But it's so interesting. I had a theory that if you can only trade once a year on your birthday, all your portfolio changes you can do only once a year, people would be much, much better off in their portfolio performance instead of listening to, unfortunately, the media, which I think overblows so much of the actual things. And in fact, I kind of have this counter media philosophy around investing that when there is a ton of media push to the positive, it's like the inverse Kramer index. When the media is pushing something really hard, that's the time to probably sell. And when the media is really dumping and dunking on something, that's the time to start nibbling away and building a position. It happens so often, especially in today's media environment, and I believe it.
My former colleague, Francis Twardowski, used to say the same thing. You remember when people just started talking about stocks on Twitter, and then there were ETFs that were created to capture social media interest on Twitter. And Francis is like, I want the inverse of that. I want to know what stocks no one is talking about, or an indicator that tells you when a stock is no longer on A1, like the front page of the newspaper, that's when it's time to get in. But when it's on the front page, either on the downside or the upside, like probably don't touch it. And then when it falls off, so TD is kind of a great example. I know TD is in the news, but like after the settlement, what happened, right? The stock has quietly drifted higher. 3M is another great example, right? It was hit with all kinds of fines and lawsuits and was in an existential crisis. Then it kind of sorted through all of that, and it's had like a nice rally. So that's also why I like this format of In the Money, because I don't, we touch on news, but I want to talk about the stocks that no one is talking about because that is where the opportunity is.
Yeah, I agree completely. What's the biggest investing myth that you wish more people would stop believing?
I think the biggest investing myth is that you can only do this with professional help. You definitely, if you want like an ease of life, and you just want kind of a set it and forget it sort of mentality, portfolio managers are really great for that. And some of them are really great. But I think that people can feel intimidated by the material and they say, well, I don't understand this. And this world isn't for me. It's particularly women. They think this world is not for them. And it's in part because the language is inaccessible and we tend to talk in jargon. So this is really core, like to foundational of like how I think about my show and how I communicate it is so important to me that my friends understand it, that my grandmother would understand it, because everyone should be doing it. And it's not something for just professionals. Mm-hmm. Yes, as an individual,
information overload is sometimes daunting for individual investors, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but like take the time to study up on it, because if you do study up on it, it's very simple, principles. Buy things that you believe in. It's sort of attractive prices if that matters to you. I don't even think, when you're investing in tech, like I don't think that matters. People bring up valuation and it's not a good indicator of returns. For example, for Amazon, when is Amazon as a value stock ever been a good indicator of returns? Right. You could convince yourself out of that for a long time. It's just like, I guess the biggest myth is to think is it's only for certain people, and investing is for everybody and everyone can do it.
Yeah, I agree completely. What's the one major trend right now or sector you think people are overlooking?
I knew you were going to ask me that too, and I still don't feel like I have a a great
I
answer.
still think energy
Um,
is still overlooked. I think the commodities have continued to be kind of middle of the pack. I think technology is taking so much of the mind share of people, rightfully so. But I think it's been put too much at the forefront of what people think versus some of the infrastructure stuff that still needs to be used and built with.
It's so funny because I feel the opposite. I don't feel I'm smart enough to invest in energy and commodities like mining. That's just my biggest investment mistakes are in those sectors, not because they
Mm.
haven't done well, but maybe because I don't understand it. When I'm down 40, 50%, which can happen in these cycles, I just like don't have enough understanding on why, despite whatever happens to the oil price, like XYZ company can do well. And over the long term, some are good companies, most are not. Most are kind of cyclical plays. And in my experience, like the long-term benefits have been in tech if you kind of pick right.
Agreed.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just like kind of my experience with it. But again, there are people who've made generational wealth in energy. And that's not to say I don't love those like Eric Nuttall or whatever energy interviews. I just feel like Rick Rule said something to me. He's like, I don't get out of my zone of comfort when it comes to investing. If I don't know something, I'm not going to pretend to know something. And so I feel like I just don't know enough to make enough money in those sectors. I
I've
know enough to
lost a
ask
lot
you
of I've
questions,
lost
like
a
you
lot
said.
of upside though because I thought that way, where I didn't do the research or at least put myself out there to learn more about a different asset
Yeah.
class. I mean, that was alternatives for me until I was able to take a leap of faith and start something. I think alternatives have been this thing that people think are also very hard to understand. What are your views on alternatives, given that you've been a public market journalist your entire life?
Yeah, people are really pushing the alternatives. And I get a lot of these pitches, and maybe it's self serving. I just don't think it's as interesting because public equities are right there. They're liquid and they're transparent. And you don't have that with alternative assets. And I just prefer things that are easy. And I think what's easier than the stock market?
Real estate. It's
It
been
is
pretty easy
again,
for real
and
estate
that's but
investors
that you really have
until
to do.
interest rates rise.
Yeah, you have to do the work, right? Like you have to be on the ground because it's really easy to blow up in real estate. And
True.
the best people in real estate are on the ground doing the work, visiting the buildings, doing the due diligence. Like even the billionaire developers that I speak to, the stories they tell me about the diligence that they're doing, um, it's not it, it's information that not everybody has access to. So will I go out there and
That's
tell
why
the
they get paid.
retail person like, yeah, that's why they get paid, and it can definitely be a part of your portfolio. I think, you know, but then you're deferring to an expert.
Yeah.
And so then you have to do your due diligence on that
It
expert.
goes against your investing myth, I guess. Okay, so changing back to in the money, if in the money becomes a runaway success, which I believe it already is, what do you think this will become? What have you thought of in terms of what you want to build in terms of like a media brand? Because it's being run as your own media company, AK Media. What's the long-term vision for you?
I think right now, we're focused on growing the podcast. In terms of long term, I don't see why I don't add other podcasts. As I said, there's a lot that I can cover in business. I don't think I would be the host of it, but there's so many other areas of the market that have strong groups associated with it, like commodities, for example. I might not be the best person to host that podcast, given everything I've said about my
Mm.
inability to do well in commodity investing. But there's a huge market for that. So if there were to be another podcast, like I think that would be something that could do really well. I hosted a show on BNN Bloomberg called The Disruptors, which was all about sort of Canadian innovation, because that's another high that I get is talking to entrepreneurs. I absolutely love being around them, not because of when they're successful. I love knowing about the dark times, like the darkest moment, because they didn't know what was on the other side of that dark moment, and they kept going anywhere. And where entrepreneurs are made and broke is like they're in the darkness and they either choose to leave, right? I can't do this, or they choose to push forward. And then when you see them and they're successful, like, of course, it's amazing, but they didn't know that that was what was waiting for them. And so I just love hearing about like those particular moments. And I think it's important to celebrate success in this country, especially, given everything now. So I think a show that maybe features that and spotlights that could also have some major legs. And I know you guys do a great job of that on your podcast as well. So I could add more podcasts. I also think, if I collect enough subscribers and things like that, I think I can create sort of a quasi investing club, because we are getting stock picks. Like, why don't we track it? Why don't we create an index off of it? Why don't we offer, unique insights based on some of those picks to a subscriber base? So right now everything is for free, but maybe down the road I would experiment with a pay model. I don't really know if I'll do any of those, but I definitely think like there's a lot that can be done as an independent. And right now, I imagine what a lot of people hear in legacy media is no, we can't do this. No, we can't do that. Or there's just like no will to do it. And there's the entrepreneurial spirit, it's no secret, is not in these large companies. They're in the smaller sort of upstarts. And what's so great about where I'm at right now is I don't really say no to anything.
Isn't it amazing? You can just try anything. Entrepreneurs are what you're, doing right now are frustrated consumers of media. Right now, media has become so democratized. It's become so easy to produce content, consume content. It's very niche down too. Like there are so many people who have hundreds of thousands of subscribers to their Substack, newsletter that are only writing about one specific thing, like quantum computing, for example. Like just so niche down in terms of the content. You can do that too. And I think it's a great idea. Let's partner. I'll do the startup, down in the dump stories, and you can do the go public IPO and public market stories. I think it's a great idea, and that's exactly what we need more of.
And you make a good point, Matt. Like, how can all these niche, small, seemingly small topics be garnering so much interest? And I think how can it be that the demand for content has never been so high, and yet the content providers are struggling? And
because they only give you that 7-minute interview.
Yes.
Right? They're so beholden to their own customers, which are their sponsors, their advertisers, that they need to have fit in this narrow box. And when you have this ability to do what you're doing, which is move fast, break things, try new things, and experiment, you can actually find a much bigger market to go after than what they're able to do. And I think that's just a factor of their business model.
Well, and like, let's use Amazon as an example. Part of why Amazon was able to move so fast is because they didn't have any legacy headaches, right? They didn't have any brick and mortar. And let's apply that same analogy to media. I'm on the board of the CJF, the Canadian Journalism Foundation. And one of the big issues, and it is an important issue, is paying for news, the big tech companies paying for news. And so what's happening is that a lot of these legacy media companies then are saying they don't view Google, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, they don't view them as partners in distribution. And in many instances, like right now, a news organization can't post on a Meta platform. And that was a big part of distribution, right? Because they're caught in a battle, an ideological battle over how this news should happen and who should pay for what. And it is important. But what that means is that the way people consume news is not being well served right now. Just because you as a legacy media org are having an issue with the major companies, that's still where people are going. 1 in 5 investors start their investing journey or look for information on social media. If you're not there, you're not where the people are. I don't care where I get my views. I get them on YouTube, I get them on Apple, I get them on Spotify, and Instagram, X, TikTok. I don't care. It all goes check, 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 right? that I just add them to my viewers, but I'm sort of unencumbered. I don't care if you go to my website. Maybe down the road I will, but right now I don't. I just want you to get the information, and wherever you get the information, that's where I'm going to be.
They have to change their model and they have to think differently than what they'd done in the past. It's kind of like how Apple had to reinvent the way 99-cent songs were being distributed with the legacy
That's right. Yeah.
media companies. And I think that's just what's going to happen now. Listen, I could talk to you forever, Amber. This has been so much fun, but let's wrap things up with our fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
I have so many. I actually I don't love to listen to business podcasts because it's so much in my world. So, but I will say I have two former colleagues that have their own business podcasts. Catherine Murray has Getting Savvy, which is like a mix of, it's like Bonds and Botox. It's like health and beauty. And I think that's really great. It reaches out to women. And then a former colleague, Sejal Patel, has her own podcast called Strictly Money. So I do recommend you check those out. And I love comedy. I actually did stand up for the first time in the last couple of months. So I love sitcoms and I love to laugh. So I love, the Smartless podcast, Conan O'Brien, Conan Needs a Friend, just like really funny ones. Seth Meyers has one.
You did your own stand up? Like you were on the mic?
I was on the mic. I did my own stand up.
Oh my
yeah.
God.
It was through
Good
Second
for
City.
you.
I did that. It was so terrifying. And it was one of these, like, I've always thought I was funny. And then it was through a class. I did like 6 weeks with Second City. And then the last class is a performance. So in front of 60 people, it wasn't huge. But so you start out and I'm like, haha, I'm a funny person. Then you start these classes and you're like, no, I've made a huge mistake. Like I'm such a loser because there's such a difference between being funny in real life and then delivering a joke. So it really honed my storytelling, and like I moderate a lot of panels, I MC a lot of things. So I thought, it would help me when I do that
completely, just doing this, right? And then all of a sudden it got hit in the face.
And then exactly. And then I did it. It was like a 5-minute set, and I totally threw my husband under the bus. It was all about like our marriage and things like that. Just like funny things.
You were just grabbing whatever you could to get a laugh.
Exactly. And it went really well. Like after the 6 weeks, that I got such a high after it. And they always say this happens. Like your first show is incredible and you'll spend your entire life chasing that. And so I write. I have like in my iPhone, I have a notes, like jokes. And I write little bits, things that I think could be bits.
That's incredible. Good for you.
I
really letting that entrepreneur and creative side out of you after leaving BNN. I love it. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog.
Well, obviously In the Money, mine is, but I read a lot. I read a lot, obviously, to prepare my newsletter. And one of my favorite strategists actually works at Deutsche Bank. His name is Jim Reed. And he writes the early morning read. And I start my missives with just like a little anecdote about my family or something, how my kids are torturing me that day. And I kind of got that from Jim Reed. I've never met him, but I know everything about his personal life. His wife doesn't like it that he golfs. He's got these twins. He's got a dog. And then he goes into like really great market insights. But I really modeled like how I do my newsletter off of that because it's one
I noticed that at the top of yours, and I love that. It was a very cute way of kind of getting people to familiarize themselves with you personally rather than just being like a robotic AI morning post.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, next is your favorite tech gadget.
I guess my iPhone. I'm not more tech savvy than that.
Next is your favorite. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if this is a tech gadget, but I hear continuous glucose monitoring is the new step counter. And so my husband and I just did this I'm not diabetic, but you just wear it for 2 weeks, but then you can see like what certain foods do
wine.
To your blood sugar.
How'd it go when you drank a glass of wine?
So not great, but what I found is like my body's actually quite efficient. And then my last day, I'll tell you, Matt, I had ice cream and like bags of gummies. And I said, oh, it's just an experiment. And my blood sugar spiked to like 11.4, which is very high. But then within within like 20 minutes, it had completely normalized. And so that was kind of like I guess everything is fine. You just see how quickly it takes your body to, absorb that sugar. But also my husband is like, he's such a paleo guy and he can be very oppressive about his views on bread. But what was interesting for him is like bread for him was fine. It didn't really result in spikes, but if he had white rice, it spikes. So it's kind of like, it's interesting. They tell you all these foods that are not good for your blood sugar, but then you get to actually see how does it affect you?
And is the goal to cut out certain things or just recognize them? Because like, isn't there also the crash afterwards
I don't know what
from
the
an
goal is.
energy?
Like,
Okay. What is the goal?
I think so. I don't know what the goal is. I think it's like step counting. What are we all doing? What are we all doing?
Well,
step
it's a good
counting?
joke for your stand-up
I
routine.
think
So let's go with that.
Yeah.
All right. Next is your favorite new trend.
Podcasting on YouTube.
Easy. Favorite book?
I just read Educated, and I don't know if it's new. I don't have a favorite, but Educated was really good. And it's about a woman who went on to be very successful, but grew up in sort of a middle America and was deliberately cut off from any education. And basically, through sheer force of will, taught herself to read, to do math. And she went on to get a master's. But not everyone in her family like had that journey. She was one of those like people who came from like a family of 8 kids or something like that. And it was just like a really interesting analysis, of kind of what's going on in middle America right now, but also like, just education is so important and how it can change, particularly a woman's life and what it did for her to finally be on that path. And you can see in the mirror of her siblings, like what her life would have looked like had she not taken that initiative.
That's a great book. Sounds interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And last but not least is your favorite life lesson.
My kids will hate this because I say it all the time. Shortcuts take you the long way, which is obvious if you try and get to point A to point B without like doing all the work, ultimately it's going to take you twice as much time. So put in the care, put in the effort now, work hard now so you can have like an easier life later. And I saw that firsthand. My mother's an entrepreneur. She started a business when she was 26 and I was maybe just born. And not like knitting. She went into nuclear medicine. And so it was like, that entrepreneurial streak in me is genetic. I saw it in my mom and I saw, she was a working mother CEO who grew a pretty huge business. And I saw what it took. It just takes hard work. You don't have to be that smart, but you do have to work hard.
But did you say nuclear medicine?
I did say nuclear medicine. Yeah.
What is nuclear medicine?
If you want, I can tell you. So she wanted to be a doctor, and she didn't have the grades. And so of course, I'm Indian. That was like a huge disappointment to the family. So she went to be a nuclear tech, which I know sounds like more important than a doctor, but basically it's like if you're getting a diagnostic test for your heart, it uses nuclear medicine technology. So she'd be the tech that administered the job. So she was just an employee at a hospital. And she thought, I bet I could do this better, more efficiently if it was in a private setting. She still ran it as fee for service. So it was publicly funded, but privately run, which meant, and her fee never changed. So this is not the right price, but let's just say like a cardiolite cost $25. She basically never got a raise from the government. Every test she did was $25. So what that incentivized her to do is, I got to do more tests. What does that mean? You reduce wait times dramatically because now you have an operator in the market who's just trying to like deal with volume. She opened up clinics all around the GTA. And so the net effect is she lowered wait times. At the same time, you need to have the doctors refer to you, right? Doctors have to refer to this test. And if they're getting a shit product, they're not going to refer to you. They'll keep going to the hospitals. So she was able to deliver like excellence, but also efficiently in a way that saved the government money and, is a model for what public-private partnerships could look like. But she was a trailblazer. She was 26. She was the only person who did that. And now there's clinics all over the place. But when my mom started as like a young Indian immigrant woman, in nuclear medicine. She was the first.
Wow, what an inspiring story, and obviously in person that you've probably looked up to your entire life. That quote, though, you said about shortcuts are the long way reminds me of the quote in the movie Road Trip where it said, if shortcuts were easy, they would just be called the way.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with the famous Amber Kanwar from the In the Money Pod.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.